He was asked a question so simple that no one expected it to matter. You would prefer the human race to endure, right? And for a moment, that felt longer than it should have. The most powerful man in the room said nothing. No joke, no philosophy, just hesitation. That pause is where this story begins, because hesitation is harmless when it comes from ordinary people, but when it comes from someone who helped build the digital systems that move money, track behavior, influence elections, and quietly reshape governments, hesitation becomes evidence. Evidence that something fundamental has shifted. This is not a story about a tech billionaire who made risky bets and won. It's not a story about politics as usual, or innovation, or Silicon Valley ambition. It's a story about what happens when intelligence outgrows empathy, when power stops believing it needs permission, and when the future is no longer designed for everyone, only for those smart enough, rich enough, or ruthless enough to escape the rest. For decades, this man has played a longer game than anyone realized, not in public, not on ballots, but inside infrastructure, financial systems, surveillance platforms, legal mechanisms, political pipelines. He doesn't argue, he doesn't persuade, he positions. And while the world was distracted by app scandals and elections, a quieter question was taking shape underneath it all. What if democracy is inefficient? What if most people are the problem? And what if the future works better without their consent? This documentary is not about conspiracy, it's about architecture, because the most dangerous changes don't announce themselves. They deploy silently, update by update, until one day you realize the system no longer asks what you think, only what you will do next. Peter Thiel does not think the way most people do, and that difference is not a personality quirk, it is a strategy. He does not measure time in election cycles, news cycles, or quarterly earnings reports. He measures it in decades, sometimes generations. To understand him, you have to abandon the idea that success comes from persuasion or popularity. Thiel has never cared about being liked. He cares about positioning. Like a chess master studying a board long after everyone else has stopped paying attention, he looks for moments where a single move quietly eliminates every alternative. In chess, the goal isn't aggression, it's inevitability. You don't defeat your opponent by overpowering them. You defeat them by arranging the board so that every move they make only tightens the trap. This is why Thiel believes competition is failure. Competition means multiple players, multiple paths, multiple outcomes. In his worldview, that's chaos. Stability comes from dominance, from monopoly, from being the only viable option left standing. This mindset explains why he avoids public debates and mass movements. Public arguments are noisy, unpredictable, and slow. Systems are not. Systems endure. Systems outlive outrage. While Silicon Valley celebrated disruption, Thiel focused on permanence. While others chased headlines, he built leverage in places most people never look: legal frameworks, financial rails, data infrastructure, political pipelines. He doesn't storm institutions. He embeds himself inside them, reshaping their incentives until resistance becomes irrelevant. There is something deeply unsettling about this approach because it doesn't feel malicious in the traditional sense. It feels calm, rational, even elegant, and that's precisely what makes it dangerous. When power no longer needs to justify itself, when it no longer seeks approval, but simply arranges outcomes, democracy stops being challenged and starts being bypassed. Thiel's long game is not about winning arguments. It's about reaching a point where arguments no longer matter. Where the board is already set, the pieces already constrained, and the future quietly moves in only one direction. Peter Thiel's worldview did not emerge in a dorm room at Stanford or inside a venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. It was formed much earlier in a place where power was not debated, but enforced, where hierarchy was visible, normalized, and brutally efficient. As a child, Thiel spent formative years in southern Africa during the era of apartheid, a system designed around a single unforgiving premise: a small minority rules and the majority complies. This was not chaos. It was order. The trains ran, the mines operated, the state functioned. And for those on the right side of the hierarchy, life was stable, protected, and insulated from consequence. His family benefited from that insulation. His father worked as an engineer in uranium operations tied to Cold War military ambitions, part of a secretive industrial apparatus that existed beyond public scrutiny. For a young mind, the lesson was not ideological, it was experiential. Power works. Inequality can be managed. Consent is optional. When Thiel returned to the United States, he did not arrive as a blank slate. He arrived with a model of society already internalized. At Stanford, he encountered a very different moral language: equality, inclusion, collective responsibility. To many students, this felt like progress. To Thiel, it felt like weakness disguised as virtue. He was academically gifted, socially isolated, and increasingly convinced that the people preaching fairness were the least capable of running anything at scale. Alienation sharpened his instincts. Instead of trying to belong, he organized. Instead of seeking approval, he built alliances. The Stanford Review was not just a student newspaper, it was a training ground, a proving space for confrontation without compromise. Here, Thiel learned something critical. Outrage creates noise, but institutions create permanence. He didn't need to win arguments. He needed to survive long enough to shape outcomes. This is where the emotional core of the story hardens. A young man convinced the world misunderstands power stops trying to explain himself and starts preparing to outgrow the system entirely. The stage is set, the beliefs are locked in. And from this point forward, every move will be about recreating at scale the kind of world he learned early on, one where a few decide and the rest adapt. PayPal is often remembered as a convenience, a simple tool that made online payments faster and easier, but that memory misses the point. From the beginning, PayPal was not just a product, it was a declaration. It was built around the idea that money should move faster than governments can regulate it, that transactions should exist beyond borders, and that trust could be replaced by code. In its earliest days, PayPal didn't grow by courting respectable institutions. It grew in the shadows of the internet economy, serving industries. Traditional banks avoided online gambling, adult content, gray market commerce. These were not accidents, they were proof of concept. Where regulation hesitated, PayPal expanded. Where oversight failed, PayPal thrived. When fraud inevitably exploded, the response was not moral reflection or restraint, it was mathematics. Patterns replaced judgment, algorithms replaced trust, suspicion became automated. This was the turning point because once behavior can be predicted, it can be managed, and once it can be managed, it can be controlled. After 9/11, fear rewired the American psyche, and fear creates demand for certainty at any cost. Thiel recognized the moment instantly. What if the same systems used to detect financial fraud could identify people before they acted? What if intention itself could be inferred from data? That question became Palantir. Palantir was not built to tell stories or sell ads. It was built to see connections. No human could track phone records linked to travel patterns, financial activity mapped against location data, social relationships transformed into risk profiles. This wasn't surveillance as spectacle. It was surveillance as infrastructure, quiet, permanent, expanding. Governments didn't adopt Palantir because it was elegant. They adopted it because it promised something irresistible: foresight, the ability to move before threats materialized. But foresight comes with a cost. When systems are designed to anticipate human behavior, every person becomes a potential suspect. Every action, a data point, every deviation, a signal. There is no dramatic moment where control announces itself. There is only gradual normalization. A dashboard here, a contract there, another data set added, another agency onboarded, and suddenly a private company sits at the center of decisions about borders, policing, war, and life itself. This is where the story crosses a line. We are no longer watching technology respond to society. We are watching society reorganize itself around technology. The tools are already in place. The question is no longer whether they work. The question is who they ultimately serve and whether anyone still remembers what it feels like to be unseen. Peter Thiel never needed a campaign slogan, because he never intended to stand in front of voters. Elections are loud, unpredictable, and constrained by public accountability. Thiel's approach to power has always been quieter, cleaner, and far more durable. Instead of running for office, he invested in candidates who could fracture the system from within, figures who didn't promise stability but disruption. Ron Paul was the prototype: marginal, uncompromising, immune to mainstream appeal. Donald Trump was the acceleration, a wrecking ball aimed at institutions Thiel had long believed were too slow, too sentimental, too democratic to survive the future. J.D. Vance became the refinement, younger, disciplined, and fully fluent in Thiel's worldview. These were not emotional bets. They were structural ones. Thiel understood something most political donors don't. You don't need to control the crowd if you can influence the choke points. Regulatory agencies, courts, data access, data, procurement pipelines. He wasn't trying to persuade America. He was trying to rearrange the incentives that govern it. When Thiel wrote that he no longer believed freedom and democracy were compatible, it wasn't a provocation meant to spark debate. It was a statement of operational reality. In his view, democratic systems move at the speed of consensus, while technological power moves at the speed of execution. The majority resists change not because it is evil, but because it is slow, risk-averse, and emotionally attached to the present. For someone obsessed with the future, that resistance feels like decay. Thiel's answer was not revolution. It was bypass, weakening oversight, delaying regulation, expanding private influence where public authority once stood, no speeches required, no mass approval needed, just access, patience, and timing. This is where the tension sharpens, because nothing about this looks illegal. It looks strategic, rational, even responsible if you believe the system itself is broken. But when power stops asking for permission, when decisions affecting millions are made in rooms with no voters and no cameras, democracy doesn't collapse, it fades. It becomes ceremonial. Elections continue. Institutions remain standing. But the real decisions happen elsewhere, quietly, efficiently, and without appeal. Thiel didn't capture politics by storming the gates. He simply waited until the gates stopped mattering. True crime usually announces itself with sirens, bodies, and courtroom drama. This one unfolds in silence. When Gawker published stories Peter Thiel considered invasive, he didn't respond the way powerful people usually do, through statements, denials, or reputation management. He disappeared, and that absence was deliberate. Behind the scenes, Thiel began financing lawsuits with a level of patience and precision that mirrored everything else he had built. The goal was never to correct a headline or win a retraction. The goal was eradication. One case at a time, he quietly supported plaintiffs willing to endure long legal battles, waiting for the moment when pressure became fatal. The Hulk Hogan lawsuit was not the beginning of this campaign. It was the execution. When a Florida jury awarded more than $140 million in damages, Gawker didn't just lose a case, it lost oxygen. The company collapsed, filing for bankruptcy. Its newsroom silenced overnight. What followed was more chilling than celebration. Thiel didn't hide his satisfaction. He framed the outcome as a public service, comparing journalists to terrorists, redefining press accountability as moral corruption. The message traveled fast even without headlines. Investigating the wrong person could end your career. Publishing the wrong story could end your institution. This was not censorship enforced by the state. It was discipline enforced by wealth, legality, and time. That distinction matters because it makes resistance harder. Courts had functioned, juries had ruled, the system had worked exactly as designed. And yet the effect was unmistakable fear. Editors recalibrated, lawyers intervened earlier, stories died in conference rooms before they ever reached the public. The chilling effect didn't require threats, it relied on precedent. This is where the story tightens its grip. No law was broken, no journalists were jailed, and yet something essential was lost. The understanding that power can be questioned without consequence began to erode. True crime is often about identifying a killer. Here the weapon was patience and the body was public scrutiny itself. What happened to Gawker wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration. And once a demonstration succeeds, it doesn't need to be repeated. The silence it creates does the work instead. Peter Thiel does not speak about saving society. He speaks about leaving it, not in the language of collapse or apocalypse, but in the language of optimization and escape. When systems become slow, emotional, or resistant, he doesn't argue for reform, he looks for exits. For years, those exits sounded like science fiction: floating cities beyond national law, underground bunkers in remote countries, the promise of Mars as a backup plan for civilization. But the vision has matured. It no longer requires distance. It is being built quietly inside existing borders. low-tax zones where corporations operate with minimal oversight, privately governed cities where rules are written by investors, not voters, financial systems designed to function beyond traditional regulation, artificial intelligence developed faster than any democratic body can realistically supervise. None of this is framed as domination. It is framed as efficiency, innovation, progress, and that framing is what makes it so effective. There is no single moment where the public is asked to consent. The changes arrive as pilots, exemptions, special districts, experimental zones. Temporary at first, always justified, always expanded. Over time, they stop feeling experimental and start feeling inevitable. This is Thiel's true legacy, not any one company or political victory, but a model for how power can evolve beyond accountability. A world where the most consequential decisions are made by those least affected by their consequences. The story ends where it began, with a question left unresolved. When the future is designed by people who no longer believe in the collective, who no longer trust the judgment of the many, what happens to everyone else? Democracies rarely fall all at once. They hollow out. They continue to function on the surface, while authority migrates elsewhere. And by the time most people notice, the system no longer asks what they want. It only predicts what they will do. This story isn't asking you to agree or disagree. It's asking you to stay awake. Power in America no longer always announces itself through speeches or elections. It moves through systems, contracts, and code, quietly shaping outcomes long before the public notices. The lesson here isn't about one man. It's about a world where technology advances faster than accountability, and where democracy can be bypassed without ever being overthrown. If we don't learn how power actually works today, we won't recognize it when it stops asking for our consent. If this investigation made you think, question, or feel uneasy, that's the point. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our future before they finish shaping it without us.